At the restaurant, my daughter-in-law yelled, "Call the manager now. This old woman shouldn't be here." My son added, "Get her out of here." I stayed quiet. The manager smiled and said, "Mom, how would you like to handle these guests?" Their faces went pale. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The evening began with a lie, wrapped in the pretty paper of a birthday gift. "We're treating you, Mom," my son Andre had announced over the phone, his voice brimming with a manufactured, jovial warmth that always set my teeth on edge. "For your 69th birthday, we're taking you to the best new restaurant in the city. Le Ciel, you deserve it." And so here I was, sitting in the back of Andre's leased German sedan, the scent of his wife Vanessa's aggressive perfume thick in the air, on my way to be treated to a dinner at my own restaurant. The irony was a small, private and deeply weary amusement. Le Ciel, the sky, was indeed the toast of New Orleans, a glittering jewel in the culinary crown of the French Quarter. It was a place of breathtaking elegance with a 6-month waiting list for a Saturday night reservation, a reservation that my daughter-in-law Vanessa had been boasting about for weeks, as if she had personally moved heaven and earth to secure it. She had no idea I could have booked the entire restaurant with a single quiet phone call. I looked at my reflection in the car window as the gas lamps of the quarter flickered past. At 69, I was a woman who had learned the profound power of quiet. My silver afro was a regal crown, my skin the color of rich, dark espresso. My deep purple dress was simple, exquisitely tailored, and spoke of a quality that didn't need to shout. I was a retired restaurateur, a woman who had built an empire, sold it, and then, when the silence of retirement grew too loud, had quietly bought back her first and greatest love. This very restaurant. I was a silent owner, a ghost in my own machine, a fact known only to my wealth manager and my most trusted employee. My children, of course, knew nothing. They saw me as their mother, Beatrice, a retired widow living a comfortable but modest life in the Garden District on a decent pension and the returns from a few sensible investments. My quiet life was a deliberate choice, a fortress. I had seen what unearned wealth did to people, and I had wanted my son to build a life of his own. I was beginning to suspect I had merely provided him with a different kind of crutch, the illusion of his own success. "Are you excited, Bea?" Vanessa asked from the front seat, not bothering to turn around. She was scrolling through her phone, her long jewel-encrusted nails clicking impatiently on the screen. She called me Bea, a casual, chummy nickname that felt like a small, constant assertion of dominance. "People are dying to get into this place. I had to pull so many strings." "It sounds lovely, dear," I said, my voice a soft, gentle murmur. "It's more than lovely," she sniffed, her tone implying that I couldn't possibly grasp the social significance of the evening. "It's an experience." Vanessa was an experience all on her own. She was poured into a tight, fire-engine red bodycon dress that seemed to be waging a desperate war against her curves. Her heels were impossibly high, her makeup a work of architectural precision. She was a woman who entered a room like a declaration of war, all sharp angles and aggressive glamour. She saw the world as a hierarchy, and she was determined to claw her way to the top using my son as her ladder, and I suspected my perceived nest egg as her safety net. Andre, my son, was the silent, stressed man at the wheel. He gripped it with white knuckles, his handsome face tight with an anxiety he tried to mask with a forced, cheerful demeanor. He was a man perpetually trying to keep up with his wife's expectations, with the lifestyle she demanded, with the image of the successful, powerful man he so desperately wanted to be. He was a good boy, my Andre, but he was weak, and his weakness was a fertile ground for Vanessa's ambition. We arrived at the restaurant. It was housed in a beautifully restored historic building on a quiet, gaslit street. A discreet, polished brass plaque was the only sign that read Le Ciel. There was no velvet rope, no clamoring crowd. Its exclusivity was based on its quiet, unassailable quality. The moment we stepped out of the car, Vanessa's performance began. She swept into the lobby as if she were royalty, her eyes scanning the room, assessing the other patrons, her expression a mixture of triumph and judgment. Andre trailed in her wake, looking nervous. I followed last, a quiet, unassuming older woman in a simple purple dress. The maître d'hôtel, a young, impeccably dressed man, greeted us with a polite, professional smile. "Good evening. Welcome to Le Ciel. Reservation for Jennings," Vanessa announced, her voice loud in the hushed, elegant space. "For 3. I trust our table is ready. I specifically requested of you." The young man's eyes flickered down his list. Of course, Mrs. Jennings, right this way. He led us through the stunning dining room. It was my design, my vision, brought to life 30 years ago and recently restored to its former glory. The ceilings were high. The walls were a deep calming blue, and a magnificent hand-blown glass chandelier which I had commissioned from a local artist cast a soft golden glow over everything. The room was filled with the quiet, happy hum of people enjoying good food, good wine and good company. We were shown to a beautiful crescent-shaped booth, with a perfect view of the restaurant's famous lush courtyard garden. It was one of the best tables in the house. "This will do," Vanessa said, a note of magnanimous approval in her voice as she slid into the booth. I smiled to myself. Of course it would do. I had called my manager Mr. Dubois that morning and had it reserved for myself, just in case. My children, in their self-absorbed bubble, believed the world revolved around them. They had no idea that I had quietly, invisibly, arranged the stars in their favor, as I had been doing their entire lives. But tonight I had a feeling the stars were about to shift, and a world they couldn't even imagine was about to be revealed. The dinner began as a masterclass in Vanessa's particular brand of aggressive, insecure entitlement. She treated the restaurant not as a place to be enjoyed, but as a stage on which to perform her own importance, and she treated the staff as her personal supporting cast, there only to serve her needs and witness her grandeur. The moment we sat down, she summoned the sommelier with a sharp, impatient snap of her fingers, a gesture of such profound rudeness that it made me physically flinch. The sommelier, a consummate professional named Jean-Pierre, whom I had known for years, glided to the table, his face a perfect mask of polite indifference. "You're the sommelier?" Vanessa asked, her eyes raking over him with a dismissive, appraising look. "I want a bottle of the Sancerre, the 2018, and make sure it's properly chilled. The last time I ordered Sancerre at a place like this, it was practically lukewarm." "An excellent choice, madam," Jean-Pierre said, his voice a smooth, placid lake. "The 2018 is drinking beautifully right now." He turned his kind, intelligent eyes to me. "And for you, Madame Beatrice, perhaps a glass of the vintage champagne you are so fond of?" I saw a flicker of annoyance cross Vanessa's face. The sommelier's familiarity with me, his acknowledgement of my own tastes, was a small, subtle challenge to her dominance. "My mother-in-law will have whatever I'm having," she cut in, before I could even respond. "We're celebrating her birthday. After all, she's my guest." The word guest was a deliberate, pointed barb. I was a visitor in her world, a recipient of her generosity. I simply smiled, and gave Jean-Pierre a small, almost imperceptible nod. He understood. He returned a few minutes later with the wine, presenting it to Vanessa for her approval with all the theatricality she clearly craved. She made a great show of sniffing the cork and swirling the wine in her glass before finally declaring it acceptable. André, my son, sat in a state of quiet, anxious misery. He was a man caught in a crossfire, and he had long since chosen the path of least resistance. He murmured his agreement with Vanessa's every pronouncement, laughed a little too loudly at her sharp, unfunny jokes, and studiously avoided my gaze. He was a hostage, and he had long ago developed a deep and abiding sympathy for his captor. As we perused the menus, Vanessa's running commentary of complaints began. "The lighting in here is a little dim, isn't it? It's so hard to read," she sighed, despite the perfectly calibrated soft golden glow that was a signature of my design. "And the music, it's a bit funereal." The music was a live jazz trio, playing softly in the courtyard, a sound so quintessentially New Orleans that it was practically the city's heartbeat. She found fault with everything from the weight of the silverware to the crease in the tablecloth. Each complaint was a small public assertion of her supposed connoisseurship, a way of telling the world that her standards were so impossibly high that even a place like Le Ciel could barely meet them. In reality, it was the desperate cry of a deeply insecure woman who believed that the only way to seem important was to diminish everything and everyone around her. I, in contrast, remained a picture of calm, quiet elegance. I was in my element. This restaurant was an extension of my own soul. I had designed every detail from the curve of the banquettes to the carefully chosen art on the walls. Being here was like coming home. I spoke quietly to the waiter, asking about the provenance of the oysters, complimenting his knowledge of the menu. I engaged with the staff not as servants but as fellow professionals, as collaborators in the beautiful complex dance of a fine dining experience. And my quiet competence, my effortless ease in this world she was trying so hard to conquer, seemed to irritate Vanessa more than anything else. She saw my calm as a judgment on her own loud, grasping behavior. She saw my quiet elegance as a rebuke to her flashy, aggressive style. I was a living, breathing embodiment of a kind of class and grace that she could not buy, and it was driving her mad. "I just don't know how you can be so quiet all the time, B," she said, her voice sharp with a barely concealed annoyance. "Don't you have an opinion about anything?" "I have a great many opinions, my dear," I said, my voice gentle. "I just don't feel the need to deafen the world with them." The barb, as soft and as subtle as it was, landed. A flush of angry color rose in her cheeks. Andre, sensing the shift in the atmospheric pressure, immediately jumped in to run interference. "So, Mom," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful. "How's the garden coming along? Got any of those prize-winning roses this year?" It was his go-to topic, the safe, neutral ground he retreated to whenever the tension between his wife and his mother became too much to bear. He didn't actually care about my roses. He just cared about keeping the peace, about placating the dragon at his side. We talked about the garden, about the weather, about all the safe and meaningless things, until the appetizers arrived. The food, as I knew it would be, was exquisite, but Vanessa, of course, found fault. Her seared scallops were a touch overdone. The sauce on Andre's quail was a bit one-note. She was a black hole of negativity, sucking all the joy and beauty from the evening, and I knew with a sinking weary certainty that the night was still young, and her performance was far from over. She was building to something, a grand dramatic climax that would place her firmly at the center of the stage. All she needed was the right cue. The main courses arrived, a silent, graceful ballet of servers placing perfectly composed plates before us. My pan-seared redfish, resting on a bed of crawfish risotto, was a work of art. The aroma alone was a symphony of Creole spices and buttery richness. I took a moment to simply appreciate it, the culmination of so much skill, creativity, and hard work from my kitchen staff. This, I thought, was what it was all about, the simple, profound pleasure of a beautiful meal. Vanessa, however, was not in the business of simple pleasure. Her filet mignon, which she had ordered medium well, a culinary sin in a place like this, but one my kitchen was professionally obligated to commit, was subjected to a rigorous prosecutorial examination. She poked it with her fork. She sliced a tiny surgical sliver from the edge. She chewed it with a look of intense critical concentration. "It's fine," she finally declared. A verdict delivered with the magnanimous air of a queen pardoning a minor offender. A little underseasoned. I took a bite of my redfish. It was perfect. The skin was impossibly crisp, the flesh moist and flaky, the risotto a creamy, decadent dream. I closed my eyes for a moment in pure, unadulterated bliss, and it was in that brief, unguarded moment of joy that it happened. Reaching for my glass of water to clear my palate, my sleeve, heavy with the drape of the silk, caught the edge of the glass. It was a small, simple miscalculation of distance, a fractional error in judgment. The heavy crystal tumbler full of ice water tipped. It fell not with a loud crash, but with a dull, heavy thud, emptying its contents in a great, spreading wave across the pristine white linen tablecloth. It was a minor accident, a common everyday mishap that happens in restaurants 1,000 times a night. The water, thankfully, had spilled away from Vanessa, splashing harmlessly onto the empty space of the large booth. A small amount had soaked the edge of the thick, absorbent tablecloth, but that was the extent of the damage. In a normal world, at a normal table, the response would have been a flurry of apologies from me, a chorus of "don't worry about it" from my dining companions, and the swift, discreet appearance of a server with a fresh napkin to cover the damp spot. But we were not at a normal table. We were at Vanessa's table, and she had just been handed her cue. For a split second, there was a stunned silence. I looked at the spreading dark patch on the white linen, my hand still frozen in midair, a quiet "oh dear" on my lips. And then Vanessa exploded. It was not a gasp of surprise or a murmur of concern. It was a shriek, a loud, sharp, theatrical shriek of pure, unadulterated outrage, as if I had just detonated a small explosive device in the center of our table. "Oh my God!" she screamed, her voice a high, piercing thing that sliced through the civilized hum of the dining room. She leaped to her feet, or rather she tried to. Her stiletto heels, so elegant when she was standing still, became treacherous enemies in her sudden, jerky movement. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the table, her whole body a vibrating instrument of indignation. "My dress," she wailed, looking down at her perfectly dry fire engine red dress as if it were engulfed in flames. It's ruined. It's completely ruined. Heads were turning all over the dining room. The quiet, happy conversations faltered. The jazz trio in the courtyard seemed to miss a beat. 100 pairs of eyes were now fixed on our table, on the source of this sudden ugly disturbance. A young busboy, his face a mask of wide-eyed panic, was already rushing toward our table with a stack of fresh napkins. But Vanessa was not interested in a solution. She was interested in a performance. "This is a disaster," she continued, her voice rising in volume and hysteria. She wasn't speaking to us anymore. She was speaking to the entire room, to her captive audience. "This is a brand new dress. Do you have any idea how much this dress cost?" She glared at me then, her eyes narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated venom. The minor accident of the spilled water had become in the twisted theater of her mind, a deliberate, personal attack. I had done this to her. I had ruined her perfect evening. "I cannot believe this," she spat, her voice a low, furious hiss. "I bring you to the nicest restaurant in the city. I try to give you a beautiful birthday dinner, and you do this. You just can't handle nice things, can you? You're a menace." The cruelty of her words, the sheer breathtaking injustice of them, was a physical blow. She had taken a simple, clumsy accident and weaponized it, turning it into a referendum on my character, on my very worthiness to be in a place like this. Andre, my son, looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. His face was a blotchy, miserable red. He was caught between the horror of his wife's public meltdown and his own deep-seated, cowardly fear of confronting her. I sat there frozen, the spilled water a cold spreading stain on the tablecloth, a perfect metaphor for the ugly, toxic mess my daughter-in-law had just created. The entire restaurant was watching, their faces a mixture of pity, curiosity, and second-hand embarrassment. My perfect birthday dinner at my own beautiful restaurant had just become a public spectacle of humiliation. And the star of the show, my brilliant, unhinged daughter-in-law, was just getting warmed up. Vanessa was a hurricane of manufactured outrage, and our table was the eye of the storm. The initial shock that had rippled through the dining room was now settling into a thick, uncomfortable silence, punctuated only by Vanessa's shrill, theatrical pronouncements of victimhood. The other diners were trying their best not to stare, but the sheer magnetic force of her meltdown was impossible to ignore. It was like a car crash in the middle of a symphony, horrifying, out of place, and utterly captivating. "This is completely unacceptable," she declared to the room at large, her arms thrown wide in a gesture of operatic despair. "This was supposed to be a special night, a celebration, and now look, my evening is ruined. My dress is ruined." She kept repeating the lie about her dress, as if saying it enough times would magically make a drop of water appear on the perfectly dry red fabric. Andre finally found his voice, but it was not the voice of a man defending his mother. It was the weak, placating murmur of a hostage negotiator trying to talk down a terrorist. "Vanessa, honey, please," he whispered, his eyes darting around at the sea of watching faces. "It was an accident. Let's just sit down. It's okay." "Okay?" she shrieked, turning her fury on him. "It is not okay, Andre. Do you see where we are? This is Le Ciel, not some greasy spoon diner. There are standards. And this," she gestured wildly at me, as if I were a piece of evidence in a criminal trial. "This is not up to standard." The dehumanization of her words, the casual cruelty of being referred to as this, was a new, deeper cut. I was no longer a person to her. I was an object, a problem, a stain on her perfect evening that needed to be removed. I remained seated, a statue of quiet dignity in the middle of her chaotic storm. I did not speak. I did not cry. I simply watched her, my expression calm, my hands folded in my lap. My silence, my refusal to engage in her drama, seemed to enrage her even further. She needed a reaction. She needed me to be hysterical, to be ashamed, to validate her outrage. My composure was a quiet, infuriating denial of her power. And so she escalated. She turned to a nearby waiter who was hovering, paralyzed with uncertainty. "You," she snapped, pointing a long, red-nailed finger at him. "Call your manager. I want to speak to the manager. Now." The waiter, a young man no older than my own grandchildren would be, flinched as if he had been struck. "Of course, madam," he stammered, and fled toward the back of the restaurant. Vanessa turned her attention back to me, her eyes glittering with a triumphant, vicious light. She had found a new weapon, the threat of corporate retribution. She was going to have me disciplined by a higher authority. This is what happens when they let just anyone in, she muttered, her voice a low conspiratorial hiss directed at Andre, but loud enough for me and the surrounding tables to hear. This old woman shouldn't be here. She clearly can't handle a place like this. She's ruining the whole atmosphere. The phrase old woman was a deliberate, calculated insult, a final, definitive stripping away of my identity. I was no longer Beatrice, no longer her mother-in-law. I was just a generic, anonymous and inconvenient old woman. Andre, my son, my own flesh and blood, finally looked at me. But his eyes held no apology, no flicker of defense. They held only a deep, profound and cowardly desperation. He just wanted the scene to be over, and he had decided that the path of least resistance was not to stand up to his monstrous wife, but to sacrifice his own mother. He leaned across the table, his voice a low, urgent plea, but his words were a betrayal as sharp as any knife. "Mom, you're making a scene," he whispered, his eyes begging me to capitulate, to absorb the blame, to make it all go away. He then glanced nervously toward the back of the restaurant, where the manager was about to emerge. "Vanessa's right," he added, the words a final, devastating surrender. He then looked at a nearby waiter and, in a desperate attempt to appease his wife, he gestured toward me and muttered the words that would forever sever the bond between us. Just get her out of here." He had done it. He had sided with her completely. He had thrown me to the wolves to save himself from a few moments of public embarrassment. In that instant, something inside me, something soft and maternal that had held on for years, finally broke. The quiet, forgiving mother was gone, and in her place was a woman made of something far colder and much, much stronger. I stayed quiet. I simply looked at my son, at the weak, terrified stranger who wore his face, and I felt a profound, bottomless pity. He had no idea what he had just done. He had no idea of the forces he had just set in motion. He thought he was ending a small, embarrassing scene. He had no idea he had just triggered the catastrophic final act of his own life. And at that moment, a figure emerged from the back of the restaurant, a tall, distinguished and impeccably dressed man, moving with a calm, silent grace that commanded the attention of the entire room. Mr. Dubois, the manager, had arrived. The arrival of Mr. Dubois was like the introduction of a new, powerful gravitational force into our chaotic, spinning solar system. The nervous energy in the dining room immediately coalesced around him. The other diners, who had been trying to pretend they weren't watching, now openly stared, their curiosity piqued. The staff, who had been hovering in a state of helpless paralysis, visibly relaxed. The captain had arrived on the bridge. Mr. Dubois was a man who inhabited his suit and his position with a quiet, unassailable authority. He was in his 50s, tall and lean, with a handsome, serious face, and a salt and pepper beard that was trimmed with a geometric precision. He moved not like a manager but like a diplomat or a statesman, his steps silent and measured, his posture perfect. He radiated an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. He did not rush to our table. He glided. He paused for a moment to have a quiet, reassuring word with the young waiter Vanessa had terrorized. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Jean-Pierre, the sommelier, who was watching from the bar. He was taking the temperature of the room, assessing the situation with the cool, practiced eye of a man who had seen and solved 1,000 such problems. Vanessa watched his slow, deliberate approach, her arms crossed, a triumphant, impatient smirk on her face. She saw him not as a person but as a tool, an instrument of her will that she had summoned to do her bidding. She believed he was coming to apologize to her, to discipline me, to restore her rightful place at the center of the universe. Mr. Dubois finally arrived at our table. He stopped a respectful few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not look at me. He did not look at Andre. He fixed his calm, intelligent gaze directly on Vanessa, the source of the disturbance. "Good evening," he said, his voice a low, respectful baritone that was nonetheless powerful enough to command the attention of the entire table. "I am Mr. Dubois, the general manager. I understand there is a problem." "A problem?" Vanessa scoffed, her voice dripping with indignation. "There is a catastrophe. First, this woman," she gestured at me with a wave of her hand, "spills water all over the table, nearly ruining my dress, and now she's causing a scene, refusing to take responsibility. I have never been so mortified in my life. This is completely unacceptable for an establishment of this caliber." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial and deeply insulting tone. "Frankly," she said, "I don't think she should be here. She's clearly not the kind of clientele you're trying to attract." She's ruining the ambiance for everyone. Mr. Dubois listened to this entire venomous tirade without a single flicker of expression on his face. He was a granite statue of professional composure. He let her speak until she had completely exhausted her supply of outrage. Until all that was left was her own ragged, self-righteous breathing. Andre, emboldened by his wife's aggression and the manager's silent presence, decided to add his own weak, pathetic contribution. "My wife is right," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth. "My mother, she's just a little overwhelmed. It's probably best if we just get her home." They had presented their case. They had laid out their accusations, their demands, their final brutal verdict on my presence. They had painted me as a confused, incompetent, and disruptive old woman who needed to be removed. And now, they waited for the manager, the man in charge, to pass his sentence. They waited for him to agree, to apologize, to offer them a complimentary bottle of champagne for their troubles, and to gently but firmly escort the problematic old woman out of his fine establishment. Mr. Dubois let the silence hang for a long, heavy moment. He surveyed the scene, the spilled water, the weeping but perfectly dry accuser, the spineless son, and the quiet, elegant old woman who had not said a single word in her own defense. And then he moved. But he did not move in the way they expected. He did not turn to me with a look of apology or concern. He did not offer to call me a taxi. He did not do any of the things that Vanessa and Andre in their wildest, most arrogant dreams had anticipated. Instead, he took one slow, deliberate step toward me. He ignored my son and my daughter-in-law so completely that they ceased to exist. He turned his body, his full and undivided attention to me, and the expression on his face for the first time changed. The cool, professional mask dissolved, replaced by a look of deep, profound, and familiar respect. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow, a gesture of deference so subtle and so powerful that it shifted the entire gravitational field of the room. And then, he spoke. But he did not speak to them. He spoke to me. "Madame Beatrice," Mr. Dubois said, his voice a low, deferential baritone that was nonetheless audible to everyone at the table and to those at the surrounding tables who were now shamelessly eavesdropping. The use of my full, formal name was a quiet, powerful statement. He was not addressing a problematic guest. He was addressing a person of status, of importance. The shift in his demeanor was so sudden, so absolute, that it was like a change in the weather. The air, which had been thick with Vanessa's hot, blustering rage, suddenly became still and cold. I saw the triumphant smirk on Vanessa's face falter, replaced by a flicker of pure uncomprehending confusion. Andre, who had been staring at the table, finally looked up, his brow furrowed, his weak, handsome face a mask of bewilderment. Mr. Dubois continued, his gaze fixed respectfully on me, his back now pointedly turned to my son and daughter-in-law. "I am so deeply sorry for this disturbance to your evening," he said, his voice imbued with a genuine, heartfelt apology that had been entirely absent when he was speaking to Vanessa. "It is inexcusable that your birthday dinner should be interrupted in such a crude and unpleasant manner." He was apologizing to me, not for the spilled water but for them. He was framing them as the problem, as the source of the disturbance. I simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, my expression serene. I was the queen, and my loyal courtier was handling a minor insurrection. And then he delivered the line that would detonate their entire world. He turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the existence of the two stunned, silent figures who were still seated at my table. His expression was once again the cool, impersonal mask of the manager. "These guests," he said, his voice as cold and as dismissive as a winter wind, "are clearly causing a problem. They are disrupting the dining experience for you and for everyone else in this establishment." He turned his full, respectful attention back to me. His next words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a thunderclap. "Mom," he asked, his voice a low, deferential murmur, "how would you like me to handle them?" The question was a seismic event. It was a complete and total inversion of the power dynamic. In that single quiet sentence, he had stripped Vanessa and Andre of all their perceived authority and had placed it, all of it, squarely in my hands. He was not the ultimate power in this room. I was. He was not the judge. I was. And my son and daughter-in-law, who had just been demanding my removal, were now reduced to the status of these guests. A problem to be handled at my discretion. The color drained from Vanessa's perfectly contoured face. Her jaw, which had been set in a line of aggressive indignation, went slack. Her eyes, which had been glittering with venom, were now wide, blank pools of pure, unadulterated shock. She looked from Mr. Dubois' impassive face to my calm one, her mind visibly short-circuiting as it tried to process a reality that was simply not possible. Andre's reaction was even more dramatic. He recoiled as if he had been physically struck. A low, guttural choking sound escaped his lips. He stared at me, truly stared at me, for the first time all night. But he wasn't looking at his mother, the gentle, slightly dotty old woman he thought he knew. He was looking at a stranger, a powerful, enigmatic figure who held his fate in her hands. A woman he didn't know at all. The blood had drained so completely from his face that his dark skin had taken on a pale grayish pallor. Their faces went pale. It was not the slow fading of color from embarrassment. It was the sudden violent blanching of absolute terror. The look of two people who have just realized that the small, insignificant pawn they were about to sweep off the board was in fact the queen. The entire restaurant, which had been a low hum of chatter, was now dead silent. Every single person in the room was watching, waiting for my response. The jazz trio had stopped playing. The waiters stood frozen, trays in hand. The quiet, elegant dining room had become a courtroom, and I was the one on the bench. I looked at my son and his wife, at their pale, terrified faces, and I felt a strange, cold, and deeply satisfying sense of peace. The humiliation they had tried to heap upon me had been returned to them 100-fold, but I was not a woman who reveled in cheap theatrical victories. My revenge was not going to be a loud, angry scene. It was going to be a quiet, elegant, and utterly devastating lesson in consequences. A lesson they would never, ever forget. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, delicious moment. A quiet, humming void filled only by the frantic, panicked thoughts that were surely racing through my children's minds. I looked at Vanessa, at her perfectly painted mouth, now hanging slightly agape, her eyes wide with a terror that was deeply, profoundly satisfying. I looked at my son, Andre, who seemed to have shrunk in his expensive clothes, his usual bravado completely gone, replaced by the naked, fearful countenance of a little boy who has just been caught in a terrible, unforgivable lie. I finally turned my attention back to Mr. Dubois, who stood waiting patiently, his expression a perfect mask of deferential calm. "Thank you, Antoine," I said, my voice soft but clear, using his first name, a small intimate detail that was another quiet, devastating blow to my children's crumbling reality. "That won't be necessary. They won't be a problem any longer." I then turned my gaze, my full undivided attention to my son and daughter-in-law. It was time for the final quiet unveiling. "You seem confused," I said, my voice not angry, not triumphant, but a simple, calm statement of fact. Vanessa found her voice, but it was a weak, reedy, pathetic thing, a pale ghost of her earlier shrill commands. "What is going on?" she whispered, her eyes darting between me and Mr. Dubois. "Who are you?" The question was directed at me, a woman she had known for over a decade. It was a question of profound existential confusion. "I'm your mother-in-law, Vanessa," I said gently. "The old woman you felt shouldn't be here." I paused, letting the words land, "but I suppose, in a more practical sense, I am also the owner of this restaurant." The statement was delivered without fanfare, without a hint of triumph. It was a simple fact, a piece of data they had been missing, and it was a piece of data that caused the final catastrophic collapse of their world. Andre made a small, choking sound. That's not possible," he stammered. You're a retired teacher. You live on a pension." I almost smiled. The narrative they had constructed about me was so deeply ingrained in their minds that even now, faced with irrefutable evidence to the contrary, they could not let it go. "I was a restaurateur before I was a teacher," I explained patiently, as if I were giving a history lesson. "It was a long time ago, before you were born, Andre. I started my first restaurant when I was just 25 years old, a little po' boy shop over on Magazine Street. It did very well." I told them the story then, a story I had never shared with them because they had never once bothered to ask. I told them about how that little shop had grown into a second, then a third. I told them about how I had built a small but highly successful and critically acclaimed restaurant group, and I told them about Le Ciel. "This was my masterpiece," I said, my gaze sweeping the beautiful, elegant room. "I designed every detail, from the menu to the music to the very color on the walls. It was my heart and my soul. 30 years ago, this was the most celebrated restaurant in New Orleans. But you sold it," Andre whispered, a faint, desperate hope in his voice. "I remember you talking about selling the business when I was a kid." "I did," I confirmed. I sold the entire group to a large hospitality corporation when you were in high school. I had made my fortune and I wanted a quieter life. I wanted to be home for you. I went back to school, got my teaching degree, and I became the simple, quiet mother you have always known. I let that sink in. I let them absorb the reality of a past, a life, a level of success they had never even suspected. But a few years ago I continued. After your father passed and the house grew quiet, I found that I missed it. The energy, the creativity, the beautiful controlled chaos of a dining room, and I heard that Le Ciel, which had fallen on hard times under corporate management, was quietly for sale. So I bought it back. I looked at Mr. Dubois, who was still standing a respectful distance away, a silent granite-like witness to the proceedings. Antoine, here, I said, a warm, genuine affection in my voice, was the very first busboy I ever hired, back at that little po' boy shop, a 17-year-old kid with bright eyes and a fierce work ethic. He has been with me in one capacity or another for over 40 years. When I bought this place back, he was the first and only person I called to run it. He is not just my general manager, he is my most trusted friend and my loyal business partner. The revelation was complete. The board was laid bare. Every piece, every move, every secret was now in the open. They were not in a restaurant. They were in my house, my kingdom. And they had just attempted to stage a coup, with a stunning, breathtaking lack of intelligence. They had tried to have the queen ejected from her own castle, and they had done it in front of her most loyal knight. The sheer idiotic folly of their actions was now crushingly, humiliatingly apparent. The silence that followed my revelation was a heavy, suffocating thing. It was the silence of a world that has been irrevocably, fundamentally altered. My son and daughter-in-law were no longer sitting in a trendy restaurant, but in the ruins of their own arrogance, the rubble of 100 assumptions and 1,000 condescensions. Vanessa looked like she had been turned to stone. All the fight, all the aggressive, performative outrage had drained out of her, leaving behind a hollow, shell-shocked woman. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, her eyes blank with a horror that was so profound it had gone past emotion and into a state of pure numb shock. Andre, on the other hand, was a mess of visible, crumbling emotion. His face was a tragic mask of shame, regret, and a dawning, terrible comprehension. He was not just processing the fact that his mother was a secret millionaire. He was processing the fact that he had spent his entire adult life treating this powerful, successful woman like a simple-minded, slightly burdensome dependent. He was seeing the full panoramic scope of his own spectacular lifelong failure as a son. A low guttural moan escaped his lips, a sound of pure animalistic despair. I need a moment with my son, I said quietly to Mr. Dubois. It was a dismissal, and he understood it as such. With a slight, respectful nod he turned and glided away, melting back into the fabric of the restaurant, leaving the three of us alone in our small, private pocket of hell. I looked at my son. Andre, I said, my voice soft but with an underlying edge of steel. I have one question for you, and I want the truth. Why? Why this performance? Why this dinner? He couldn't meet my eyes. He stared at his hands, which were twisting a linen napkin into a shredded, mangled mess. I don't know what you mean, he mumbled, his voice thick with a lie that was as weak and as pathetic as he was. Don't you? I asked. You bring me to the most expensive restaurant in the city, a place you could not possibly afford. You allow your wife to treat me with a level of contempt that is breathtaking in its cruelty. There was a purpose to this evening. It wasn't a birthday treat, it was a business meeting. What was the pitch, Andre? What was the six-figure investment you were planning to ask for? His head snapped up, his eyes wide with a new, fresh wave of terror. I had not just seen through his actions. I had seen through his intentions. How did you know? He whispered. Because I am not a fool, I said simply, and because my staff are not just my employees, they are my family, and they are loyal. I didn't need to explain further. He understood. Mr. Dubois, or one of the other veteran staff members who knew me, had overheard them. They had been plotting at the bar before I arrived, rehearsing their lines, planning their attack on what they believed to be my modest retirement fund. Their treat was the appetizer. The main course was going to be a request for a massive, life-altering amount of money to bail out whatever failing business venture he had gotten himself into this time. The confirmation of his motive was the final piece I needed. This wasn't just a spontaneous act of disrespect. It was a premeditated, calculated attempt to manipulate and exploit me. The humiliation, the condescension, the cruelty, it had all been part of a strategy, a way to make me feel small and grateful, to soften me up before the financial kill. It was Vanessa's idea, wasn't it? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Andre was not a mastermind. He was a follower. A puppet. He just nodded, a single miserable jerk of his head. He was broken. The fight was gone. All that was left was the pathetic, quivering core of his own weakness. I looked at Vanessa. She was still silent, still frozen, but her eyes, which had been blank with shock, were now beginning to glitter with a new cold and calculating light. She was no longer a deer in the headlights. She was a cornered animal, and the fear was quickly being replaced by a cold, reptilian fury. She was not ashamed. She was not remorseful. She was angry that she had been caught. She was angry that she had so spectacularly, so publicly miscalculated. In that moment I saw her and my son's relationship with her with a perfect, chilling clarity. She did not love him. She had invested in him, in his family name, in the future inheritance she believed was her due, and he, my son, had allowed himself to be a willing, if weak, accomplice in his own mother's emotional and financial betrayal. The last flicker of maternal pity I felt for him died in that instant. He was not just a victim of his wife's ambition, he was her co-conspirator. They were partners in a crime of the heart, and it was time for them to face the consequences together. I stood up, my movements calm and deliberate. The quiet, forgiving mother was gone for good. The retired restaurateur, the woman who had built and managed an empire, the woman who knew how to handle a bad investment, was now in charge. "Stay here," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "Finish your dinner. I need to have a word with my manager." I walked away from the table, leaving them sitting in the wreckage of their own making. I did not look back. I found Mr. Dubois in his small, impeccably organized office just off the main dining room. The room was a stark contrast to the opulence outside. It was a functional working space with a simple desk, a few chairs and a wall of discreetly hidden security monitors displaying feeds from every corner of the restaurant. He was standing in front of them, his arms crossed, watching the silent, dramatic feed from the camera pointed directly at my table. He had seen everything. He turned as I entered, his expression a perfect professional mask, but his eyes held a deep, quiet fury on my behalf. "Madame Beatrice," he said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. "I am so sorry, I should have intervened sooner." "You did perfectly, Antoine," I said, my voice calm. "You allowed them to show me exactly who they are. That is a gift, however painful." "What are your instructions?" he asked, his gaze shifting back to the monitor, where my son and daughter-in-law were now engaged in a low, furious, whispered argument. "Shall I have them removed?" I looked at the screen, at their two miserable, angry faces, trapped in the golden light of my beautiful dining room. Having them thrown out, making a loud, dramatic scene that was Vanessa's style. It was not mine, my revenge. My lesson had to be as quiet, as elegant, and as devastatingly effective as the restaurant itself. It had to be a dish served cold, on the finest china. "No," I said after a moment. "Let them stay. Let them finish their very expensive meal. Let them drink the wine they so arrogantly ordered." Mr. Dubois looked at me, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had been expecting a command for immediate, decisive action. But I continued, a slow, cold smile touching my lips. "I do have one specific, quiet instruction for you regarding their status for the remainder of the evening." I explained my plan. It was simple, subtle, and in its own way profoundly cruel. It was a lesson in the invisible architecture of power, a lesson on the difference between being a guest and being a customer. Mr. Dubois listened, his expression unchanging, but as I finished, the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. He understood perfectly. It was a strategy that appealed to his own deep professional pride and his fierce, quiet loyalty to me. "Consider it done, Madame Beatrice," he said, with a quiet, profound satisfaction. "I will inform the staff immediately." I left him to his work, and did not return to the table. I had no more words for my son or his wife. My part in their evening was over. Instead, I went to the bar where Jean-Pierre, the sommelier, greeted me with a look of deep, sympathetic understanding. "A glass of your favorite champagne, madame?" he asked softly. "Please, Jean-Pierre," I said. I took my glass and walked out into the courtyard garden, the source of the beautiful, gentle jazz that had been the soundtrack to my humiliation. I found a small, secluded bench near a trickling fountain, hidden from the view of the main dining room. I sat in the soft, fragrant darkness, the cool night air a balm on my spirit. I could hear the distant, happy chatter of my other guests, the clinking of glasses, the beautiful improvisational melody of the saxophone. This was my world. This was the sanctuary I had built, and I had just defended it from a hostile invasion. Back in the dining room, my son and daughter-in-law were left in a state of suspended, agonizing uncertainty. They were alone at their beautiful table, the remnants of their half-eaten main courses growing cold before them. They had been abandoned by their hostess, their victim, their intended mark. They were adrift in a sea of luxury, and they were just beginning to realize that the tide was going out with a terrifying speed. Their argument, I am sure, was a bitter, toxic thing. Vanessa would be blaming Andre for his weakness, for his family. Andre would be blaming her for her greed, for her arrogance, for pushing him into this catastrophic mess. They were two rats trapped in a beautiful velvet-lined box, and they were beginning to turn on each other. But eventually, their anger would have given way to a more practical, pressing concern. What to do now? They were in the middle of a meal at the most exclusive restaurant in the city. To simply get up and leave would be another public humiliation, and so, pride and perhaps a desperate, foolish hope that they could somehow salvage the situation kept them rooted to their seats. They decided to brazen it out. They would finish their meal. They would pretend that nothing was wrong. They would try to reclaim the power they had so spectacularly lost. But they were about to learn that in a place like Le Ciel, power is not something you can demand. It is something you are given, and their privileges had just been quietly, ruthlessly revoked. The shift in service was not a dramatic, obvious event. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere around their table. A slow, chilling drop in the temperature of their experience. It was a death by 1,000 tiny cuts, a masterclass in the quiet, professional art of disrespect. The first thing they would have noticed was the absence of their waiter. The young man who had been attending to them with such deferential care had vanished. In his place, a rotating cast of junior staff would now drift past their table, their eyes studiously avoiding contact. Their empty wine glasses, which had been refilled with an almost psychic efficiency all evening, now sat glaringly, reproachfully empty. The bottle of Sancerre, still a third full, remained in its silver ice bucket just out of their reach. A tantalizing, unservable promise. After 10 minutes of this pointed neglect, a frustrated Andre would have finally managed to flag down a passing busboy. "Excuse me," he would have said, his voice tight with an annoyance he was trying to suppress. "Can we get some more wine poured?" The busboy, a young man who had likely just been briefed by Mr. Dubois, would have looked at him with a blank, polite smile. "Of course, sir," he would have said, and then simply walked away, never to return. Their plates from the main course, which should have been cleared within minutes of them finishing, remained in front of them for a full half-hour. They sat there, a congealing, accusing monument to a meal that had turned to ash in their mouths. The other tables around them were cleared, reset and reseated with a silent, graceful efficiency. Their table alone was left to fester in its own small puddle of disgrace. Vanessa, a woman whose entire sense of self was built on being the center of attention, was now being subjected to the most exquisite form of torture she could imagine, being pointedly, professionally ignored. The fawning service she had demanded as her due had been replaced by an impenetrable wall of polite indifference. She was no longer a VIP, she was not even a customer, she was an obstacle. A piece of furniture that the staff was patiently waiting to have removed. The humiliation was a slow, creeping poison. I can picture her, her back ramrod straight, her face a mask of furious, impotent rage. She would be whispering venomously to Andre, demanding that he do something, and Andre, my weak, defeated son, would be trying to catch the eye of a waiter, any waiter, his small, desperate gestures for attention going completely, deliberately unseen. Finally, a junior manager, a young woman I had personally mentored, would have approached their table. Her smile was bright, but her eyes were cold. "I am so sorry for the inconvenience," she would have said, her voice a smooth, practiced apology that held no actual regret. "But we have another party waiting for this table. They have been waiting for quite some time. We are going to have to ask you to move." "Move?" Vanessa would have sputtered, her voice a disbelieving squeak. "But we haven't even had dessert." "Of course," the manager would have said, her smile never faltering. "We have prepared another table for you to continue your evening." And then, she would have led them on a public walk of shame. They would have been escorted from their prime, beautiful booth with its view of the courtyard, across the entire crowded dining room, every eye following their progress, and they would have been reseated at the worst table in the entire restaurant, a small, cramped two-top located directly beside the swinging doors of the kitchen entrance. It was a table usually reserved for walk-ins on a Tuesday night. A table of last resort. The air there was hot and smelled of garlic and the clatter of pots and pans. The swinging doors provided a constant jarring rhythm of noise and frantic movement. It was a chaotic, undesirable, and deeply profoundly humiliating place to be. They sat there in their fine clothes at their tiny, terrible table, a public spectacle of their own fall from grace. The sommelier Jean-Pierre, who had earlier been so attentive, now glided past their new location without a single flicker of recognition in his eyes. The other diners who had witnessed Vanessa's earlier tirade would be whispering behind their menus, their expressions a mixture of pity and a cruel, delicious schadenfreude. They had been moved from the royal box to the cheap seats in the back of the theater, and the entire audience knew it. The lesson was clear. In this kingdom they were no longer royalty. They were not even members of the court. They were commoners, and their brief, arrogant reign was over. The taste of their humiliation, I knew, would be far more bitter than any under-seasoned filet mignon. They sat at their purgatorial table for what must have felt like an eternity. The chaotic ballet of the kitchen, the clanging of pans, the sharp shouts of the chefs, the constant swinging rush of the waiters, was their new dinner music. They didn't order dessert. They didn't order coffee. They just sat there, two miserable, silent figures marinating in their own public shame. The grand celebratory birthday dinner had devolved into a hostage situation where they were both the prisoners and the guards, held captive by their own pride and their inability to simply admit defeat and leave. Finally, after what must have been a tense whispered negotiation, André made a small, jerky gesture to a passing waiter. "The check, please," he would have mumbled, his voice a low, defeated thing. This was the moment the entire staff had been waiting for, the final, elegant checkmate in the game I had orchestrated. A few minutes later, Mr. Dubois himself emerged from the back. He was holding a single, leather-bound bill folio. He glided to their small, terrible table, his expression once again a perfect, unreadable mask of professional composure. He did not say a word. He simply placed the folio on the table in front of André, gave a slight formal nod and turned to walk away. André, in a final desperate act of defiance, a pathetic attempt to reclaim some shred of his lost authority, called out to him. Excuse me," he said, his voice a little too loud. "You give that to my mother. She's handling everything tonight." He was still clinging to the fiction that he was the honored guest, but this was all still part of the treat he was being given. Mr. Dubois stopped. He turned back slowly, his calm, intelligent eyes fixing on my son. There was no anger in his expression, only a kind of profound, pitying finality. "Sir," he said, his voice as cool and as clean as a polished knife, "I was not aware that your mother was still a part of your dining experience this evening. You and your wife have been dining as independent patrons for the past hour." He then delivered the final, devastating and beautifully rehearsed line. "Madame Beatrice," he said, the formal title a final, brutal reminder of the power dynamic André still refused to accept, "has instructed me to inform you that as of 8:15 p.m. you were no longer her guests. The bill is yours." He did not wait for a response. He simply turned and walked away, leaving the leather-bound folio on the table between them like a ticking time bomb. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They just stared at the closed folio, at the small golden crest of Le Ciel embossed on the leather. It was a Pandora's box of their own making, and they were terrified to open it. Finally, with a trembling hand, André reached out and opened it. I had seen the preliminary bill in Mr. Dubois' office. I knew what was on it. There was the outrageously expensive bottle of Sancerre that Vanessa had so arrogantly demanded. There were the multiple rounds of pre-dinner cocktails they had consumed at the bar while waiting for me. There were their appetizers, their main courses, the side dishes. There was an automatic 25% gratuity, a standard for parties who have been exceptionally difficult. The total at the bottom of the long, itemized list was a staggering 4-figure sum. It was a number that was likely equivalent to André's entire monthly take-home pay. It was a bill designed to inflict not just financial pain but a profound, existential shock. It was the receipt for their arrogance, the price tag for their cruelty. A low, strangled sound escaped André's lips. Vanessa, seeing the look on his face, snatched the bill from his hand. I can only imagine the look on her face as she saw the number, as she saw the cold, hard, mathematical consequence of her own gluttonous performance. The designer dress, the stiletto heels, the entire persona of a woman for whom money is no object. It was all about to be revealed as a pathetic, fragile fraud. A new, more practical and far more terrifying panic began to set in. The public humiliation was one thing. The inability to pay, The prospect of being arrested for theft of services in the most exclusive restaurant in New Orleans was another thing entirely. The game was no longer about pride, it was about survival, and they were in a very, very deep hole, with no visible way out. The panic that gripped their small, terrible table was a silent, frantic thing. The world of the restaurant, the happy chatter of the other diners, the cool, melodic notes of the jazz trio, it all faded into a distant, mocking hum. Their universe had shrunk to the size of that small piece of paper, to the impossible four-figure number that stood between them and escape. Andre, his face a sickly greenish-gray, was the first to move. He fumbled in his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. He opened it with trembling fingers, a desperate hope in his eyes that some miracle, some forgotten reserve of cash might be hiding within its leather folds. He had of course nothing but a few $20 bills and a collection of credit cards. He chose his primary card, a flashy-looking piece of plastic with a high-sounding name that was, in reality, a mid-tier card with a modest credit limit. It was the card he used to project an image of success. The card he used for his everyday lattes and lunches. It was not a card designed to handle the bill from Le Ciel. He slid the card out of the folio and tried to hand it to a passing waiter. "We're ready," he mumbled, his voice a dry croaking thing. The waiter, who had been meticulously instructed by Mr. Dubois, took the card without a word and walked away. The next few minutes must have been the longest of my son's life. He and Vanessa sat in a state of suspended, agonizing animation, their eyes fixed on the back of the restaurant, waiting for the verdict. The waiter returned. He was not carrying a receipt for Andre to sign. He was carrying the small handheld credit card machine itself. He placed it on the table in front of Andre, his expression a perfect, unreadable mask of professional politeness. On the small screen in stark digital letters were two words: transaction declined. The final, definitive, public statement of his financial impotence. He did not have the money. He did not have the credit. He was a fraud, and the machine had just announced it to the world. "There must be a mistake," Andre stammered, a flush of hot, desperate shame creeping up his neck. "Try it again." The waiter, with the patience of a saint, ran it again. The result was the same. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice a low, mortifying murmur. "The card is being declined. It says insufficient funds." Vanessa, who had been watching this scene with a look of mounting horror, could not stand it any longer. She snatched her own wallet from her designer handbag. "Here," she snapped, pulling out her own equally flashy credit card. "Use mine. His bank is always having issues." She was trying to save face, to project an image of a couple with so many accounts that they sometimes got them confused. It was a pathetic, transparent lie. The waiter took her card. He ran it. "I'm sorry, madam," he said, the apology now a well-rehearsed line. "This card has also been declined." Of course it had. Her card, I knew, was almost certainly maxed out from her constant, insatiable shopping. She lived in a state of perpetual high-interest debt, always just one purchase away from her credit limit. They were trapped. Utterly, completely, and humiliatingly trapped. They had consumed a meal fit for royalty, and now they were faced with the peasant's problem of having no way to pay for it. The other diners were starting to notice. The whispers were growing louder. The couple at the table by the kitchen, the ones who had made such a scene earlier, were now unable to pay their bill. The drama was reaching its final, delicious, and deeply shameful act. Mr. Dubois, who had been watching from a discreet distance, chose this moment to glide back to their table. His timing, as always, was impeccable. "Is there a problem with the payment, sir?" he asked Andre, his voice a smooth, silken blade of professional concern. Our cards," Andre stammered, his face a mess of sweat and shame. "There seems to be some kind of bank error." "I see," Mr. Dubois said, his expression unchanging. "In that case, we do have a protocol. We can of course call the New Orleans Police Department. They can help mediate the situation and arrange a payment plan with you. It's a simple matter of filing a report for theft of services." The words police department and theft of services were the final fatal blows. The specter of a public arrest, of a criminal record, of their names appearing in the police blotter, was a horror beyond their imagining. It would be the complete and total annihilation of the precious, fragile image they had spent their lives curating. The fight was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that was left was the raw, primal terror of two people who had flown too close to the sun and were now in a spectacular, fiery freefall. And there was only one person who could possibly catch them. The specter of police involvement was the final, brutal checkmate. Vanessa, who had been a pillar of furious, defiant rage just moments before, completely crumbled. A low, keening sound escaped her lips. The sound of a woman who has just seen her entire carefully constructed world turn to ash. She sank back in her chair, her face a mask of chalky, abject terror. The designer dress, the perfect makeup, it was all just a costume on a woman who was now facing the very real, very unglamorous prospect of being arrested. Andre looked like he was going to be physically ill. He stared at Mr. Dubois, at his calm, implacable face, and he finally understood that this was not a negotiation. It was a sentence. He was a man with no cards left to play, no bluffs left to call. His eyes, wide and terrified, darted around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. They flickered past the watching faces of the other diners, past the stern, unmoving figure of Mr. Dubois, and finally they landed on the one person who represented his last, most desperate and most humiliating hope. He looked through the lush greenery of the courtyard garden and saw me sitting on my quiet, secluded bench, a silent, watching queen on her throne. He had no other choice. He had exhausted every other option. Pride, arrogance, defiance. They were all luxuries he could no longer afford. All he had left was the bitter, unpalatable currency of humility. With a shaking hand he reached for his phone. He looked at me, a silent, pleading question in his eyes. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Permission granted. He fumbled with the phone, his fingers slick with a nervous sweat. He found my number and pressed the call button. I felt the vibration of my own phone in my pocket, but I did not answer it. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. I let him sit in the agony of his own self-inflicted humiliation for a few moments longer. Finally, I pulled the phone from my pocket and answered, my voice a calm, quiet hello, as if I had no idea who could possibly be calling. Mom? His voice was a choked, broken whisper, a sound I had not heard since he was a little boy who had fallen off his bicycle. Mom, it's me. I know who it is, Andre, I said, my voice gentle but devoid of any immediate sympathy. Is everything all right? You sound upset. He stammered, the words catching in his throat. I could hear the background noise of the restaurant, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of voices. We're still at the restaurant. Mom, there's a problem with the bill. A problem? I asked, my voice a perfect imitation of mild maternal concern. What kind of problem? There was a long, agonizing pause. I could almost feel his shame, his humiliation, radiating through the phone. This was the hardest sentence he had ever had to utter in his entire pampered life. We can't pay it, he finally whispered, the words of final, complete, and total surrender. Our cards, they're not working, and the manager, he's talking about calling the police. The last words were a rush of pure undiluted panic. Oh dear, I said, my voice still calm, still measured. That does sound like a problem. I let him twist in the wind for another long, painful moment. I let him feel the full, crushing weight of his own helplessness. He had spent his entire adult life projecting an image of strength, of success, of a man who was in control, and now he was reduced to this. A terrified child, whispering into a phone, begging his mother to save him from the consequences of his own arrogance. Can you please help us? He finally choked out, the words the ultimate admission of his own failure. I'll pay you back. I swear. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment of his complete and utter capitulation. The moment where he finally truly understood that the power he had so arrogantly assumed was his, had never been his at all. It had always been mine, and I had just let him borrow it for a little while, just to see what he would do with it. And what he had done was to build a bonfire of his own vanity and set it ablaze. Stay right there, Andre, I said, my voice shifting from that of a concerned mother to one of quiet, decisive authority. Don't say another word to anyone. I'm coming back to the table. I hung up the phone. I took one last slow sip of my champagne, savoring the crisp, cool taste of victory. Then I stood up and began the slow, deliberate walk back into the dining room, back to the scene of my son's unconditional surrender. The lesson was almost over. It was time for the final, painful exam. I walked back into the dining room like a queen returning to her court after a brief recess. The atmosphere around their table was thick with a new kind of silence. Not the angry, tense silence of before, but the heavy, expectant silence of a courtroom awaiting a verdict. Andre was still holding his phone, his face a pale, tear-streaked mask of relief and shame. Vanessa was slumped in her chair, Her arms wrapped around her self-broken, defeated figure. The fire was gone from her eyes, replaced by a dull, empty look of despair. Mr. Dubois stood a respectful distance away, a silent, granite-like sentinel, his presence a constant, quiet reminder of the stakes. I did not go to their table. I went to Mr. Dubois. "Antoine," I said quietly, "would you be so kind as to bring me the bill?" He handed me the leather-bound folio. I opened it and reviewed the charges, my expression calm and businesslike. It was indeed a staggering sum, a monument to their own gluttony and arrogance. I then walked to the table. I did not sit down. I stood at the head of the small, terrible table, looking down at my son and his wife. I placed the open folio on the table in front of them so they could once again see the number that had so thoroughly broken them. "This," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a final judgment, "is the cost of your evening, the cost of your performance, the cost of your disrespect." Andre flinched, but didn't speak. "I will cover this bill," I continued, "but I want to be very, very clear. This is not a gift. This is a loan, the final one you will ever receive from me. And you will pay it back, Andre. Every last cent, with interest." I looked at my son, and for the first time I let him see the full, unvarnished depth of my disappointment, the profound, aching grief for the son I had lost to his own weakness and greed. "I kept my success a secret for a reason," I said, my voice now a low, sorrowful murmur. "Your father and I, we wanted you to build your own life, to find your own character, to become a man of substance, not just a man of style. We wanted to give you the gift of your own ambition, not the poison of unearned wealth." I shook my head slowly. "But we failed. Or perhaps, you failed. I gave you every opportunity, every advantage, and all you have learned is how to want. You have never learned how to earn." I turned my gaze to Vanessa, who was staring at me with a new dawning look of something that might have been comprehension, or perhaps just cold, hard calculation. "And you," I said, my voice hardening, "you have been his co-pilot on this journey to nowhere. You have encouraged his worst instincts. You have mistaken his weakness for generosity. You have built a life on a foundation of debt and delusion, and you have treated me not as family but as an obstacle to be overcome, an old woman to be managed and eventually disposed of." The truth of my words, stark and unadorned, hung in the air between us. "Tonight," I said, my voice dropping to a final quiet note, "you wanted to treat me to dinner. You wanted to impress me. You wanted to pitch me your next failing business venture, to get your hands on my modest retirement fund. You came here to take. That is all you know how to do." I reached into my purse and pulled out my own credit card, a discreet, heavy black card with no limit. I handed it to Mr. Dubois. "Antoine, please take care of this, and add a 50% gratuity for the staff. They have earned it tonight for their patience and professionalism." He took the card with a respectful nod. "Of course, Madame Beatrice." I looked back at my son and his wife. At the two broken, pathetic figures sitting in the wreckage of their own making. "The free ride is over," I said, the words a quiet final closing of a door that would never be opened again. "From now on you are on your own. I suggest you learn, very quickly, how to live within your means. Because your means, as of tonight, have been significantly and permanently adjusted." I did not wait for a response. I did not need one. The lesson had been delivered. I simply turned and walked away. My head held high. I walked out of the restaurant, out of the beautiful, elegant world I had built, and into the cool, quiet and blessedly peaceful New Orleans night. The drive home in the taxi was a silent, solitary journey. The festive lights of the French Quarter, usually a source of such joy and pride for me, seemed muted, their colors less vibrant. I felt no triumph, no elation. The victory was a hollow, bitter thing. I had not won a battle. I had simply survived a catastrophic family amputation. I had cut off a part of myself to save the whole, and the phantom limb was already beginning to ache. I could only imagine the drive home for Andre and Vanessa. The silence in their car would not have been peaceful. It would have been a toxic, superheated vacuum, thick with unspoken accusations and the stench of their shared humiliation. The power dynamic of their relationship, a dynamic built on the false premise of his success and her aspirational glamour, had been shattered. He was not the powerful provider she had married. He was a weak, dependent man who had just been publicly devastatingly neutered by his own mother, and she was not the glamorous, untouchable queen she believed herself to be. She was a woman in a tight red dress with a maxed-out credit card and a mountain of shame. Their relationship, I knew, would not survive this. It had been a partnership of convenience and shared delusion. Now that the delusion had been stripped away, all that was left was the ugly, inconvenient truth of their own individual failures. In the weeks that followed, a quiet, profound silence descended. I did not hear from them, not a call, not a text, not a single word. It was a silence I did not break. I had delivered my final lesson, and it was now up to them to do the coursework. The gossip, of course, rippled through our small, interconnected social circle. The story of the scene at Les Ciels became a whispered, legendary tale, the details distorted and embellished with each retelling, but the core of it remained. Andre and Vanessa Jennings had been publicly humbled, and the quiet, unassuming Beatrice Jennings was not the woman anyone had thought she was. I began to receive calls from concerned friends and family, wanting to know my side of the story. I told them nothing. It was a private family matter, I would say. My voice calm and final, offering no fuel for their speculative fires. My dignity, my privacy was the one thing they could not take from me. The real fallout for Andre and Vanessa was not social, but financial. The abrupt and total cessation of my quiet, invisible support was not a gentle weaning. It was a sudden, brutal shock to their system. The illusion of their lifestyle, which had been propped up by 1,000 small unseen subsidies from me, began to crumble with a terrifying speed. The lease on their luxury sedan was the first to go. Without my financial backing, they could no longer afford the payments. It was repossessed, a quiet, humiliating event in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. Vanessa's perfect Instagram life, which had so often featured the car's gleaming hood ornament, suddenly went silent. Next was their condo. They couldn't make the rent. They were forced to break their lease, to downsize, to move from their trendy high-rise to a small, anonymous apartment complex in a less fashionable part of town. The stage for their performance of success had been dismantled. Andre's business, a vaguely defined marketing consultancy that had never actually turned a profit, collapsed. Its primary client had, in reality, always been me. Through a series of consulting fees I had paid him for non-existent work, a quiet, face-saving way of funding his life. When the money stopped, the business ceased to exist. They were forced to confront the stark, cold, and unforgiving reality of their own finances. They had to get real jobs. They had to learn to budget. They had to learn the meaning of the word no. The world, which had always seemed to them a place of boundless easy credit, was now a place of hard limits and difficult choices. About 6 months after that fateful dinner, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that they had separated. The fracture that had begun at that small, terrible table by the kitchen had finally irrevocably broken their marriage apart. Vanessa, I was told, had moved back in with her mother, her dreams of a life of effortless luxury in tatters. And Andre was on his own, for the first time in his life. The news brought me no joy, only a deep, weary sadness. This was the consequence he had earned. This was the bitter fruit of the seeds he had sown. But he was still my son, and his pain, however self-inflicted, was still a distant, aching echo in my own heart. A year passed, a year of quiet, of healing, of rebuilding the peaceful fortress of my own life. Les Ciels flourished, its reputation for quiet, unassailable excellence only enhanced by the whispered legends of its mysterious, powerful owner. I spent my days there, not as a commander but as a mentor, a quiet presence in the background. I had found a new project, a new passion. Her name was Simone, a brilliant, fiercely talented young chef from the Tremé neighborhood. She had started as a line cook, but I had seen a fire in her, a creative genius and a work ethic that reminded me of my own younger self. She was a culinary artist, but she had no business training, no capital, no connections. She had the talent, but she lacked the foundation. And so, I decided to become her foundation. I took her under my wing. I spent my afternoons in the kitchen with her, not cooking but teaching. I taught her about food costs, about inventory management, about negotiating with suppliers, about how to lead a team. I was investing in her, pouring the time, resources, and wisdom that had been so casually squandered by my own son into this deserving, grateful, and profoundly talented young woman. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, as Simone and I were going over the quarterly profit and loss statements in my office, Mr. Dubois knocked quietly on the door. He held a single white envelope in his hand. "This just arrived for you by courier, Madame Beatrice," he said. The envelope was plain, with my name written in a familiar, slightly messy script. It was from Andre. It was the first communication I had received from him in over a year. My hands were perfectly steady as I took it. I waited until Mr. Dubois had left the room before I opened it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper and a check. The letter was short, the words simple, stripped of all his former bluster and arrogance. Mom, I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve it. The last year has been the hardest of my life, and also the most necessary. I lost everything, and in the process I finally started to find myself. I have a real job now. It's not glamorous. I'm a shift manager at a logistics company. It's hard work, but it's honest. And for the first time, it's mine. I know I can't ever truly repay you for the financial cost of my mistakes, let alone the emotional one, but I have to start somewhere. This is the first payment. There will be one every month, for as long as it takes. I am so sorry, Andre. I looked at the check. It was for a small, almost pitiful amount. $50. But it was not the amount that mattered, it was the act itself. It was a gesture of accountability, of remorse, of a man finally, painfully, beginning to take responsibility for his own life. It was a single green shoot of hope, in a field I had long thought was barren. I put the check and the letter aside, a quiet, unresolved chord in the symphony of my life. My son was on a new path. It would be a long and difficult one, and I did not know where it would lead. But for the first time he was walking it on his own 2 feet. I turned my attention back to the young woman sitting across from me, her eyes bright with a fierce, hungry ambition that I recognized as my own. Now Simone, I said, my voice clear and full of a new focused purpose. Let's talk about the fall menu. I have an idea for a duck confit that is going to make the city lose its mind. She leaned forward, her face alight with a shared passion. We were building something new together, something beautiful and strong. I had learned a hard lesson. You cannot choose your family, but you can choose your legacy. And I was choosing to invest mine not in the barren ground of entitlement, but in the fertile soil of talent, gratitude and hard, honest work. It was a much wiser and far more satisfying return on investment. Thanks for watching.